Hey guys, so in this video here I'm going to be showing you an entire time lapse of this lion painting you can see here and sort of walk you through the general steps that I take when painting something like this. And so for this painting I actually took a different approach than I normally do, and I only used black, white, and burnt umber, not really worried about the colors, more focusing on the highlights and shadows, and then I came back in with a glaze afterwards to give it the color, which I will address that once it comes up in the video later on. So the first step I always take is I just block in the general shapes, proportions, highlight, shadows of the animal I'm painting. Not really worried about detail, but more focusing on where those brightest highlights and darkest shadows are. Again, for this step, since I'm glazing, the color really doesn't matter. And you can see it's very sloppy, but more emphasis on the lighter and darker areas. And then I'll come back in and clean it up later, obviously. And so you'll see as I start the eyes here, I always will typically try to block in just a general tone. Doesn't really matter. I'll fix the color later on. And most animals, their eyes consist of a shadow on the upper eyelid followed by a brighter highlight along the bottom of the eye. And I'll typically work dark to light, so I will gradually get lighter and lighter for about 3 to 4 coats for these eyes, adding little specks, little highlights, and then after that I come back in with some darker shadows to contrast the highlights. You always see in these eyes what I think can always make them look really real is those white specks that kind of give it the glassy, hazy look. I'll typically use a blue shade and then add white highlights to that instead of just pure white. I think it can make it look more real and give it that more glassy look with a glare to it almost. I think that can make the eyes really pop, really stand out. You'll see as I'm blocking in the hairs here, first couple layers are more sloppy, just blocking in the general direction and length of the hair. I think that's one of the biggest details to focus on, especially for someone new, is really paying attention to the direction of the hair and the length of each hair. That can really make them look real and stand out. One issue I do see a lot, I myself had, and I'm still working on, is while you want to follow the direction of the hair, you don't want them all to be going the same direction. You want to include variation. They're wild animals. They obviously don't brush their hair or anything. Their hair is kind of wild, has variation in it, and that can really make it look more real instead of having all the hairs flowing in the same direction. Along with that too, you don't want them all to be the exact same length. It's all about including variation to make them look like they really are out in the wild. So here on the right side, you can see it's obviously a much more shadowed area. So with the highlights there, make sure they're not near as bright as you would in the actual highlights of the face. I think that can be an issue, is you can include highlights in your shadows that are too bright that kind of take away the shadow, and it's hard to tell that it's really a shadowed area. Along with that, it's also important to incorporate some darker hairs to really make those shadows stand out more. And I know in this phase, since I'm glazing, it looks very chalky and more white and almost harsh. There's a lot of sharpness in between the hairs, but once you come back in with the glaze at the end, that'll kind of soften it up and mute it. And the brighter the area is, the more saturated the glaze will be, is the way I look at it. Here you can see still just following the same typical process, working about 3 to 4 layers, not worried about the color at all, just the direction and hair length and capturing where the light is really hitting the face. As you can see, working through the mane, much longer hairs, more wispy hairs. And a lot of times what I will do is I will water down my paint very, very lightly so you can see through each layer, and it gives the fur depth and more layers to it, allowing it to look more real and more three-dimensional. So as I start on the upper section along the right side of the mane and the ears, it's a much more shadowed area, and it kind of fades into the background, into the shadows. So Once again, making sure not to include too many bright highlights, as it would take away from the shadow, and then come back in with some darker hairs at the end. And while this continues, I'll go ahead and introduce the topic of glazing. Basically what glazing is you thoroughly water down your paint to where it's primarily water, but it still has those color pigments within it, and you're sort of just washing over it to add the color onto those lighter hairs and lighter brush strokes. You don't want to make it too watery, and you also don't want to put too much pressure down, as you'll start kind of tearing up the paint. And here you can see the nose. I'll always paint black first and then almost blob on the paint, getting lighter and lighter all the way up until my brightest highlights, and then I'll come back in with some darker tones. Here you can see I'm starting to glaze. I mean, it's primarily a golden hue that I'm using for this line, with some more reddish orange in the main in some sections. Like I said, it's just water and paint, and you kind of lightly wash over it, not pressing down too hard. And once you like where the color is, you can then come back in with your last highlights to really make it pop and make those highlights stand out. Along with the shadows, come back in with your darkest darks to make the shadows really stand out more. And that's why I like turning them black and white. It does make the highlights and darker shadows much easier to locate and let you know kind of where to put an emphasis on the lights and the darks. And then the last and final stage is the whiskers and kind of brightest white hairs, stray hairs, that I think can give it that wild, more natural look. And for my whiskers, again, I use my angled brush. It's definitely a more stressful part of the painting, but it can be rewarding. And that is it. That is my entire process. I know it's very quick and abbreviated, but I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will be talking to you all soon.